The trees leaned closer each time they turned their backs. At first it seemed like an illusion, the kind that happens in deep woods when the light shifts and your eyes misjudge distance. Old forests are full of tricks like that. Shadows stretch differently under thick canopies. Angles change when trunks stand too close together. But illusions don't repeat themselves with such precision. "Stop," Mara said quietly. Her voice was swallowed by the damp air almost immediately. Sound traveled poorly here, as though the forest had stuffed moss into every hollow space where echoes might live. Jonah halted behind her. I nearly walked into his back. "What is it?" he asked. Mara pointed behind us. We had just passed a large pine, its bark blackened with moisture and wrapped in pale strands of moss. I remembered it clearly because one of its roots had curled across the trail like a knuckle of bone, forcing us to step over it. Now the root touched the opposite side of the path, and the trunk leaned slightly farther inward. "That tree moved," Mara said. Jonah looked at me. I shrugged uneasily. "Maybe it's the slope." "There is no slope." She walked back toward it slowly, boots sinking softly into damp soil. The ground smelled rich and wet, layered with the sweet rot of leaves that had been falling here for centuries. Her palm pressed against the bark. Cold, rigid, immovable. Yet Jonah crouched near the root and frowned. "I stepped over this," he said. "It wasn't this far across." The forest around us creaked. Not loudly, just the slow groan of wood under pressure somewhere deeper between the trunks. There was no wind. The branches overhead hung perfectly still. We stood there listening. Somewhere far off, something rustled through leaves. But it didn't move closer, or farther away. It simply rustled, again and again, like someone pacing in place. "Let's keep going," Jonah said finally. None of us argued. The trail wound deeper into the forest, a narrow ribbon of packed dirt threading between enormous trunks. Moss draped from branches like wet fabric, brushing our shoulders as we passed. The deeper we walked, the dimmer the light became. Sunlight filtered through layers of needles far above, but the beams didn't fall cleanly. They bent through the branches at strange angles, stopping halfway to the ground or sliding sideways across bark. Our footsteps made dull, padded sounds in the soil. No crunch, no snap, just a soft thud each time our boots sank into the earth. After a while Mara stopped again. "Look," she pointed ahead. Two trees flanked the trail like gateposts, except the gap between them was barely shoulder width. Jonah frowned. "That wasn't like that before." "We would have noticed," I said. The trunks leaned inward slightly, their bark slick with moisture. Branches stretched toward each other overhead, forming a rough arch that filtered the gray light into thin slivers. Jonah stepped through first. We followed. The moment we passed between them, a creak sounded behind us. We turned immediately. The gap had narrowed. Not much, just enough that the bark now almost touched. Mara's voice was barely a whisper. "They're doing it when we're not looking." No one laughed, because all three of us had heard the creak. The forest fell quiet again. The distant rustling continued, still in the same place. We kept walking. The trail twisted through the trees in gentle curves. Yet every time we rounded a bend and glanced back, the path behind us seemed smaller. Not shorter, just tighter. Trunks that had stood several feet from the trail now leaned closer. Branches dipped lower. Once Jonah turned around suddenly and froze. "What?" He pointed. There wasn't a root there. A thick root now stretched across the trail behind us. The soil around it looked undisturbed. No torn dirt, no exposed earth. Just a root where there had been empty ground moments before. Mara rubbed her arms. "I feel like something's watching us." The words hung in the heavy air, and somehow the forest seemed to listen. A branch creaked above us, slowly bending downward. Another rustle sounded deeper in the trees. Still unmoving, still repeating. We walked faster, but the forest adjusted. Paths narrowed. Branches reached across the trail like crooked fingers. More roots appeared underfoot, forcing us to step higher and higher with each stride. Jonah checked the map on his phone. No signal, he muttered. Then he frowned. The trail should split near a creek. But the trail never split. Instead it curved again, and again, and again, until the trees began to form a loose ring around us. At first we didn't notice. The trunks leaned inward slightly, their branches interlocking overhead. The space between them shrank with each turn of the trail. Jonah realized it first. Wait! We stopped. He pointed behind us. The path we had walked moments earlier had vanished. Not collapsed. Not blocked. Simply gone. Trees now stood where the trail had been. Their bark identical to the others. Their roots buried deep in the damp soil. Mara shook her head slowly. That's impossible. The creaking sound returned. Louder now. Multiple trunks shifting. Adjusting. When we turned to look, nothing moved. But when we looked away, another creak. Jonah turned suddenly again. Too late. The trees had leaned closer. We started moving quickly. But the forest moved with us. Every step forward tightened the ring. Branches wove together overhead, forming a tangled lattice that dimmed the light even further. Shadows stretched along the ground in thin black fingers. Roots rose from the soil where there had been none before. Our footsteps became shorter as the space narrowed. Eventually the trail simply stopped. We stood in a clearing no wider than a small room. Trees surrounded us on every side, leaning inward at angles that defied gravity. Their branches crossed overhead like bars. No wind moved them, yet the trunks groaned softly, pressing closer. Jonah turned slowly in place. They're hurting us. The distant rustling stopped. For the first time since we entered the forest, there was complete silence. Then a final creak. The trees leaned inward another inch. Mara whispered, "What happens when they reach us?" No one answered, because the trunks weren't just leaning anymore. They were waiting, and as the forest slowly closed the remaining distance, the soil beneath our boots began to soften, as if something below the surface had started making room. Their campsite was surrounded by ropes tied into nooses, swaying without wind. Caleb noticed them first. At the edge of the trees, just beyond the metal post that marked Site 14, something pale hung between the trunks. At first he thought it was camping line. Maybe someone had strung up food bags or hammocks. But the shape was wrong. A loop, a knot, another loop. "Hey!" he said quietly, lowering the bag of firewood he'd been carrying. "Do you see that?" Lena looked up from the cooler. "What?" He pointed toward the trees. 3 ropes hung from low branches along the tree line. Each one was tied into a perfect noose, the loops dangling chest-high above the ground. They swayed slowly. Left, right, left. There was no wind. The campground sat in a bowl of tall pines, their branches heavy with late summer moisture. The air was still enough that the smoke from nearby campsites rose in straight gray columns. Yet the ropes moved. Lena walked toward them, boots crunching softly on gravel. "Someone's got a weird sense of humor," she said. Caleb followed, a knot tightening in his stomach. When they reached the tree line, the smell of damp bark and pine sap thickened. The ground here was darker, packed with years of fallen needles. Up close, the ropes looked old, yellowed fibers, stiff with age. But the knots were fresh. The coils were tight and clean, as if they'd been tied recently by someone who knew exactly how to make them hold. Caleb touched the nearest rope. The fibers rasped faintly under his fingers. The knot sat firm, still warm from friction. "Someone was just here," he murmured. Behind them, Evan emerged from the tent carrying a lantern. "What are you two staring at?" Lena gestured toward the trees. Evan stepped closer. "Jesus." The 3 of them stood there quietly, because once you saw them, you realized there were more. Not just 3, a dozen, maybe more. Each one tied to a different branch just inside the woods, spaced evenly around the campsite like markers. They formed a rough circle around Site 14. Caleb slowly turned, counting. 6, 7, 8. Lena swallowed. They're all facing inward. Evan frowned. Facing. The loops, she said. Every noose hung with its opening tilted toward the campsite. Toward them, the rope fibers creaked softly as they swayed. Left, right, left. Caleb looked up at the branches. The bark beneath the knots was freshly scraped. Pale wood exposed where rope had rubbed against it. Someone had tied these recently. Very recently. But why here? Lena asked. Evan shrugged. Prank, maybe. Some teenagers messing around. Caleb gestured toward the campground road visible through the trees. This place is full. Why not any other site? Evan didn't answer. A faint creak sounded. One of the ropes turned slowly in the air, twisting slightly as it swayed. The loop opened wider. Lena stepped back instinctively. Did that just? It's just the rope settling, Evan said quickly, but his voice had tightened. Caleb stepped closer to another noose. He watched the knot. The rope moved again. Not much, just a slight lift, as if someone invisible had gently tugged it upward. The loop rose a few inches, then dropped back. All three of them stared. That wasn't the wind, Lena whispered. There was still no wind. The forest beyond the campsite sat perfectly still. Even the leaves overhead didn't stir. Yet the ropes continued their slow motion. Left, right, left. Caleb forced a laugh. Okay, that's creepy. But it's probably animals brushing the branches or something. Lena gestured upward. The branches aren't moving. They looked. She was right. The branches remained rigid, thick with needles and moss. Only the ropes moved. A low creaking sound echoed from the far side of the circle. One of the nooses had started swinging slightly faster. Not wildly, just enough that its shadow stretched across the ground toward the fire pit. Evan stepped closer to it. Maybe they're tied to thinner branches, he said. Trees shifting. He reached out and grabbed the rope. It stopped instantly. The sudden stillness made the forest feel even quieter. Evan tugged the rope experimentally. The knot held tight. The branch above didn't move. He let go. The rope hung motionless for a moment. Then it began swaying again. Left, right, left. But now it swung toward him. Evan frowned. That's weird. Caleb glanced around the circle. Every rope had started moving a little more. The loops shifted slowly in the air, like pendulums measuring time. The creaking of fibers grew louder. Not loud, just enough to hear when the forest went quiet between distant bird calls. Except there were no bird calls anymore. The woods beyond the ropes had gone silent. Lena stepped backward into the campsite. I don't like this. Relax, Evan said, though he had stepped away from the rope too. Someone probably set these up for Halloween or something. It's August, she said. Caleb rubbed his arms. The air had cooled. Or maybe it only felt that way now. He walked toward another noose. This one hung slightly lower. The loop hovered at neck height. He leaned closer, studying the knot. That's when the rope tightened. Just slightly. The loop narrowed. Caleb froze. Did you see? The rope lifted. An inch. 2. Like a fishing line being gently reeled upward. Caleb jumped back. The rope fell slack again. But now the noose swung harder. Left, right, left. The others had begun moving too. Not wildly, but with a deliberate rhythm. Like breathing. Lena's voice shook. We should leave. Evan glanced toward the road. Yeah, maybe. They started packing quickly. Sleeping bags stuffed into duffels. Lanterns shut off. Cooler slammed shut. But as Caleb turned toward the car, he stopped. The ropes had changed again. The circle had tightened. The nooses hung closer to the campsite now. Not much, maybe a foot closer. But the distance between rope and fire pit had definitely shrunk. You guys, he whispered. Lena looked up. Oh no. The loops swayed in slow unison now. Left, right, left. The creaking of fibers echoed softly through the trees. Evan grabbed his keys. Forget packing. Let's go. They walked quickly toward the car parked at the edge of the gravel pad. As they crossed the campsite boundary, Caleb glanced back one last time. The ropes had stopped moving. Every loop hung perfectly still, facing the empty center of Site 14. Waiting, he opened the car door and slid inside. The engine started. Headlights flooded the campsite with pale light. For a moment nothing happened. Then one of the ropes lifted again, just slightly, as if someone unseen had slipped a hand into the loop. Caleb looked deeper into the trees, and for a brief second he thought he saw movement beyond the rope line. Not a person, just a darker shape among darker trunks. Watching, the headlights shifted as Evan backed the car onto the campground road. The trees swallowed the campsite, but as they drove away, Lena turned in her seat and stared out the rear window. "Wait," she said. "What?" Evan asked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "There are ropes at the other campsites too." Caleb twisted around. In the fading distance between the trees around Site 15 and Site 13, pale loops swayed gently in the darkening woods. And they weren't empty. Not all of them,